So the Vintage project basically is a search for ways to establish an online tool for the assessment of the key competences for lifelong learning. And immediately this is an important thing to sort of reflect upon, because here we are not talking about the, let's say, vocational abilities of a person, but we are talking about competences that allow a person to engage in lifelong learning. In the presentations we heard this afternoon, we, especially Mr. Kellner gave a presentation of views on competence. And we sort of made an attempt to integrate these various approaches. So the EU approach itself consists of the knowledge, attitudes and skills. Then there is, you spoke about the validation through the level 5 procedure, where at least actions are included. So, but we think that maybe the most sort of broad definition would include, let's say, something like a competence. I came here without knowing in particular whom would be my audience. So I thought maybe I need to explain something about what is competence learning or acquisition of competences. But now that I saw or heard your questions and I saw the interaction here, I think I can be at least quick. So we think that competence learning basically is active learning rather than receptive learning. It is a way of personalized learning. You spoke about narrative, that kind of approaches in which the person is the owner of the knowledge and part of the story of the development of it. In realistic settings, so not only absorbing the knowledge as such, but be able to develop that knowledge and then later on apply it in realistic settings. Not necessarily the real settings, but realistic. Competence-oriented learning implies that you, in these realistic settings, bring people in more and more complex situations in which they, together with others, in mutual dialogue, increasingly self-sufficient, are aiming to actually perform in that context. And while doing all of that, they continuously reflect on their learning processes and try to build further upon the strategies they have as far as their learning is concerned. This has implications for how competence-oriented education should be organized. Because of the need for realistic settings, it has to be contextualized. So it's not knowledge as such that is transmitted, but it's always knowledge in a particular situation that evokes or challenges people to perform or to act. There must be an open learning environment. The idea actually behind competence-oriented education is that there is no such a thing as a fixed body of knowledge that only has to be transmitted, but it is the dialogue, it is the interaction that raises the level of the knowledge of all the people taking part in the learning process. It must be challenging, purposeful. The context is meant, for instance, to create that sense of purpose. It should be responsive to the needs of the learner and be an activating, mutually interactive narrative. I like very much the so-called storyline approach, in which people do not process knowledge as facts and relations, etc., but they also think about the people that developed the knowledge or that were affected by the knowledge. So the knowledge as such becomes part of a story, and the best is even if the learner him or herself is also part of that story. The learning process or the education process requires that the expert educators also appear to be expert learners and demonstrate that. What appears to be rather ineffective is if learning groups sort of focus only internally, if they are only connecting to each other in their learning process. So the contextualization or the need for contextualization also requires that the learners, individually or together, or with the educators, connect to the actors, stakeholders, peers outside their learning group. So, well, you saw the model that I presented about competences, and let's say traditionally we focused on testing someone's knowledge by asking questions about the knowledge, the skills, and the attitude. And as I wrote in the model, that means that a person indeed has those elements in his or her luggage that provide the potential to act. But the actual act is not there yet. And we like to focus on exactly that. So the measurement of these actions, by measuring the quality of particular behavior repertoire in a particular context. With an online tool you will imagine that will be rather difficult, so that the particular context will have to be reconstructed. So we have to sort of cross-examine the self-assessors about their experience. So the experience must be real. Well, we as Vintage Group go through several steps to move forward in our own learning process. So we started to make an inventory of practices throughout European countries or regions. Then we made, each of us contributed to our database of literature on key competences and the assessment of key competences. Then once we had, and commented to it, but once we had all this literature and all these elements to be included in the key competences, we try to put that all together in this model that I suggested. And then, of course, the question arose, and how can we on Earth measure the cloud of elements that is included in competence in a systematic and transparent way. So we also made an inventory of approaches and tools how to assess, well, like in the presentations here today, in some presentations more than in others. You see this mix. I especially like this slide you showed of all these approaches to assessment and how they what a richness of tools actually you can include in an assessment. Then we want to develop a tool for supported self-assessment, and that is also something you all came up with. That assessment is not a matter of administering a tool; it is a process. It is a journey for that matter. It is a journey you are not even doing on your own. It is a journey on which you share your experiences with others, in which you involve others in the process of your own assessment and yourself in the assessment of what the others experience. So it is a social process. And we think that this whole process has to be embedded in a wider set of supporting tools. So even if we think about one tool in the end, then there will be several ways of applying it, and each of these ways will require different support. So what are we thinking this assessment is necessary for? Because we are doing a lot of effort to make this assessment tool. And well, here we saw a kind of debate about whether assessment should be resulting in, let's say, a number of credits, and it should be able to recruit the right people for the right job, or should it be something that is empowering people and developing them? Or, well, we also recognize this difference, and we think that it's not one truth, and another approach is not the right one, but it is a sort of set of options. So if you have a self-assessment, it might be that you want to be informed about who am I, what am I good at, what would be my potential, what would be worth developing for myself. Next function could be orientation, like, and if I would develop further in that direction, what would that imply? So what would I need to learn in order to become better? If the learning process then starts, you get the question, am I on the right track? How can I improve my learning? This summative and formative distinction you also presented. Then I think that in several situations the learning process is not only aiming at raising individual performance, but you want to perform, for instance, better as a team. So there is maybe an element of collective learning that is to be assessed. If the learning process reaches its end, you could say, how well did I do? How did I compare to others? That's the selective assessment. Or what is my future potential? So what is the prognosis for me? What level do you think, based on the assessment, could I reach? Yeah. So what would all of this, what would be the benefits for a learner? Well, I think it would help the learner to assess his needs, to validate the learner, like in this level 5 approach, to self-evaluate his or her performance or his or her learning process. It might be empowering. It gives you a sense of backbone, a self-esteem. If you know that you are not just that person without certificates and without diplomas, but you are someone who does have competences and who can make that clear to others and to yourself. It can be a useful help for formal acknowledgement of prior learning and experience. So it gives you a voice if you want to defend your case. It can help you plan your study career. It can help you plan your work career. And it helps in employment and appointment matters. And last but not least, maybe related to this empowerment thing, it gives you a profile that you can make known to the world and talk about with others. I must say that when I see the list, I see that I step into the same pitfall that many people step in, and that is that we tend to vocationalize adult education, adult learning. So I think that maybe in the next presentation I need to emphasize also more on the informal kinds of learning that are, let's say, serving the developments needed for a person's life, leisure, social position, participation in the community, things like that. Yeah. What do we wish to have as a product? We would like to have, in the end, a web-based tool. We would like that web-based tool to be emphasizing the needs and perspectives of the adult learners. In discussing a tool, immediately we in our group even have a sense of we should avoid the risk that this is a tool that can be used against people. It should be a tool that supports people. We have discussed that we think that assessment is not the end of a learning process, but the assessment itself is a learning process. It means that from going through the process of assessing yourself, you derive a lot of new insights. You gain insights. So it is a learning process and can best be treated like that. So it needs to be, let's say, approached from a didactical point of view that brings people further. That, not in the last place, means it should also be motivating. So it should not be a bureaucratic, endless list of questions, but it should indeed be a motivating process in which you connect to people, in which you can show products, in which you can count your blessings, in which you know that those terms are better than answering questions or ticking boxes. So we see it as a social process, and this is repetitious, but I still think that by the end of a presentation like this, it's still important to say it should be an inclusive approach. So if I speak about selection function of assessment, then I do not mean that it is meant to exclude people, but the selection function is there just meant to say, how do my achievements relate to those of others? Yeah, I think, this is, I wanted to say actually as a last thing that from the discussion that I heard here, I think that something we have to keep in mind ourselves is this distinction between personality and learning outcomes. As you may have seen in the double triangular model, we focus rather specifically on an educational perspective. We are focusing on the things that can be changed about people, and we are not focusing on identifying the kind of people we are. We are sort of focusing on the development, but we need to rethink that maybe. We have to find a proper balance in our tools between the measurement function and the social process. I think that the challenge of producing an online tool on key competences for lifelong learning is to maintain and preserve the holistic nature of a competence. In all the definitions you see that a competence is a holistic thing. And I think that if we analyze it too much and bring it back to all nitty-gritty elements it is composed of, then I think that we should be aware that by measuring the details, you don't measure yet the full, let's say, gestalt. Then I think that we also carefully are thinking about and will need to think about the self-assessment element that we are referring to in the tool. I, for now, would like to say that we are focusing on a self-initiated and self-directed kind of assessment, but the involvement of others, especially with some kinds of assessments, like for instance, if you want to have a career advice or a study advice, then it's wise to have someone else involved. Or if you want to have a summative evaluation, are you the one then to judge, or is it better that you are the one to initiate the involvement of someone who can judge? So that sort of thing we need to solve. And last but not least, and I thought that refers back to your kwaliteitsentwicklung again, that I think that the main challenge for the Vintage project also is to manage its complexity. So I think that if we start measuring the competences of the people that want to assess themselves, or if they are assessing that, then we do not only learn about how to assess, but we also learn about the key competences. We learn about what is the language in which we can talk about the key competences. So, and also we learn about the best process to support the development of that all. So I think that we do not only need to manage the complexity, but also learn from that. So that the assessment becomes part of the lifelong learning that will lead to the quality development. So, yeah.
Mr. Lakerveld, I just have a question. Are you going to develop a tool for all 8 competences of the European framework?
So far, I think yes. but since managing complexity is one of our challenges, the answer maybe you should ask the questions again in 1.5 years.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.